video? Does it say just evolution or what is evolution?
Just evolution.
Should you also watch the video?
Eventually. All right. So when we talk about evolution, evolution is a gradual change usually that happens to a population, a group of organisms over a period of time. And people have thought about how species change over time for thousands of years. But there's one scientist that's most known for his research about evolution. This is him. His name's Charles Darwin. Is that a name you've heard before, I would guess? Yeah. Darwin was English, from England. And Darwin he was interested in nature and science from a young age, but never really decided on a career or anything. And then he got this opportunity to travel around the world on a ship that was called the HMS Beagle. And this trip took 5 years. It's a long trip. And on the Beagle, he had a job. His job was as the ship's naturalist. What that means is, as the Beagle left England and traveled around Africa, down the east coast of South America, around the tip, back up, Galapagos Islands, around Australia, around Cape of Africa, back to South America, and eventually back to England. Along the way, his job was basically to study the plants, the animals, fossils, the rocks, to collect specimens to bring back to England. He basically was just an overall scientist aboard the ship. And so he studied all these different places. A great opportunity for somebody interested in science, because he got to go through all these different parts of the world that many people never would have been to, and see a wide variety of living things and ecosystems. Okay? And so he took this long journey, this 5-year journey, and eventually made his way back to England. He wrote a book about his trip called The Voyage of the Beagle, and did some other research on different topics. But it wasn't for around 30 years after he returned to England that he actually put together his ideas about evolution. It took him a long time when he got back to England, sort of thinking about things, looking at the collections, thinking about the different organisms he saw along the way. And Darwin started to think about, why is there such variety of living things that I saw along my voyage? Why did I often see similar animals in, say, Australia, in the dry conditions there, that I saw in the dry conditions in South America? Or why did I go to these nearby islands and the birds living there were all very similar, but with some distinct differences that helped them survive? So we started thinking about all of this, and eventually came up with this idea of natural selection, which we're going to learn about a little later on. This is what he looked like in his old age, Darwin. He's on the front of your packet as well. And before, the time around Darwin, and well before that as well, there were some common ideas about the Earth that most people believed. And here's a couple of those things. People thought that the Earth was only about 6,000 years old. Okay. Which is not that old. It may sound like old, but it's not. And people also often thought that the species we see today all over the world have always been here. And they never changed over time. They were here at the beginning of the Earth, and they basically stayed that way, and they're unchanging. But this idea of evolution says, well, maybe that's not the way things work. Maybe the species here today were not always here. Maybe they've changed over time. Maybe species become extinct. New species form from other species. And those are the ideas about evolution. Because around this time, there were lots of developments in various sciences that made people start to think about things a little differently. One of the main ones was in geology. Geologists studying the earth and the earth's rocks and so forth started to say 6,000 years is not a long enough time to produce all of the things we see when we look in the geological record. They started to think, well, the earth is much, much older than that. The actual age of the earth we know now is about 4.6 billion years old. Obviously, that's quite different than the previous ideas about 6,000 years old. And geologists started to realize that the earth is changing all the time. Mountains can be created over a long period of time. Mountains can be eroded. Continents can move around the earth over this millions and millions of years. If the earth only 6,000 years, that would not be long enough to result in all of these changes. And so Darwin agreed with these changing ideas, and Darwin thought that the earth changed, the rocks and the continental plates changed, so why can't species change as well? Why can't species evolve if it had? There's been 4.6 billion years of our planet. That's a lot of time for species to gradually change over time, for species to become extinct, for new species to form. And so these ideas helped Darwin formulate his ideas about natural selection. You know, one of the things scientists saw was that, well, there's fossil saved dinosaurs. Well, they don't exist anymore. So they had to be here at one point in the past and are no longer here. So what happened to them? Or they could go up to mountaintops and in those rocks find fossils of ocean life, shells from crustaceans or mollusks. Well, obviously a top of a mountain is not an ocean. How did they get there? And so those are some of the geological ideas that led to these changes. Okay? And so Darwin said, I think species change over time. They're not fixed inside. This video is going to give you kind of an overview. So before we actually talk about the details of evolution and natural selection, this video gives you like an overview, a preview, so that as we talk about it, you'll have a little bit more background knowledge about what we're going to be explaining. So just watch this. It's a little bit longer, but...
This episode is concluded with responsible for generous donations for learning and comments, proof avenue, and contributions from individual viewers like you. Stated Clearly presents, what exactly is evolution? In biology, the theory of evolution doesn't tell us exactly how life began on Earth, but it helps us understand how life, once it came into existence, diversified into the many incredible forms we see now and in the fossil record. It also helps us make sense of the way in which modern creatures continue to adapt and change today. In biology, evolution can be defined as any change in the heritable traits. Those are physical traits like fur color in mice, spots on the wings of butterflies, or instinctive behaviors like the way that dogs greet their friends would sniff, within a population across generations. This definition can be a bit confusing, so let's see how it works. All healthy living things, from single-celled amoebas to flowers to dolphins, are capable of reproduction. We have children. We make copies of ourselves. We do this by duplicating our DNA and passing that DNA on to future generations. DNA is a chain-like chemical stored inside each one of your cells, which tells them how to grow and function. Your DNA contains coded information on how to build you. The information in your DNA is different than that of, say, a daffodil's DNA, which is why you look and function differently than a daffodil, the information in your DNA is slightly different than that of Elvis Presley, which is one of many reasons you don't look or act quite like he did. Single-celled amoebas and other simple creatures reproduce by copying their DNA inside their guts, moving both copies to either side of their body, splitting in two right down the middle, and then growing back to full size. If all goes well, the two new amoebas will be exact copies of each other, but in nature, things aren't always perfect. When DNA is being copied, errors can occur which modify the DNA code. This is what we call a DNA mutation. These mutations, which happen completely on accident and randomly to any part of a DNA strand, can produce variation in the body shape and function of the creature who inherits the modified DNA. In this case, our new little friend has an arm that stretches extra long. If he survives long enough to grow and reproduce, that extra stretchy arm, which is now coded for in his DNA, will be passed on to his children. Evolution. Any change in the heritable traits within a population across generations has officially occurred. Reproduction for dolphins and badgers and people is a little more complicated. We have to find ourselves a partner. When two badgers get together and, fall in love, a sperm cell from the father, which contains a copy of half of his DNA, only half, combines with the egg cell of the mother, which contains half a copy of her DNA. The result is a brand new cell with a complete set of DNA instructions, all the information needed to divide and grow up into a brand new badger. The new child matures to be similar to her parents, but also unique because she develops some traits from her mother's DNA and some from her father. Her new combination of traits can be passed on to her children, and again, evolution. Any change in heritable traits within a population across generations has officially occurred. Besides a unique recombination of her parents' traits, she might also have developed some completely new traits of her own due to DNA mutations. Maybe extra hairy ears, for example. If she survives long enough to have kids, her DNA will combine with the DNA of her partner, and she'll pass on those extra hairy ears to at least some of her children. Again, evolution has officially occurred. So there you have it. Evolution is really pretty simple. Scientists and normal folks everywhere witness evolution happening all the time. Small changes like the ones we've seen here can add up over multiple generations to create dramatic changes. If you were to go back in time just a few thousand years, you'd find that all dogs, for example, originally evolved from an ancestral group of gray wolves. The evolution of those wolves from generation to generation was guided by humans. People were selecting wolves with the traits they liked, letting them breed, and then only keeping the puppies with the most desirable traits. As time went on, different breeders preferred dogs with different features. Some selected for large size, some for small size, some for brains, others for brawn. Today, wolves have branched out into hundreds of breeds, very few of which look and behave much like their ancestors. A massive amount of observable evidence from many different fields such as genetics, chemistry, paleontology, and mathematics overwhelmingly suggests that just like all dogs share a common ancestor, all living things, me, you, pufferfish, banana trees, if you go back far enough, also share a common ancestor. We are literally related. We don't know what the first life form was or exactly how it came to be, but the simple process of reproduction with variation over billions of years looks to be responsible for all the diversity of life we see today. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, hold on here. Isn't evolution random? To do something functional like turn a wolf into an adorable mini poodle, random evolution had to be carefully guided by an intelligent dog breeder. Researchers claim that all mammals evolved from an ancient shrew-like creature, but the difference between a shrew and an elephant is far greater than that of a wolf and a poodle. Who guided that process? Who, was the breeder. In the mid-1800s, two men, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, independently discovered that a breeder is not necessarily needed. There is another force capable of guiding random evolution to produce order and complex function. They called it natural selection, which happens to be the entire topic of our next video. But before you move on, let's recap what we've learned so far. Biological evolution is any change in inheritable traits within a population across generations. All healthy living things have copies of themselves, but they do so imperfectly. Small variations can add up over generations to create dramatic differences in the body form and function of living creatures. Evidence overwhelmingly suggests that all life on Earth is related. So remember, next time you invite family and friends over for a holiday feast, you're actually just inviting family. That includes the turkey and the pumpkin in the pumpkin pie. I'm John Perry, and that's evolution stated clearly.
Right, so you see a general overview there of
Thanks for watching our show.
what we're going to be learning about here with evolution. So evolution, we're going to phrase it a little differently. So it's this scientific theory developed that species change over time. And evolution is what can explain to us why we have such a wide variety of living things, why certain things are similar or different from each other. All of this can be explained through evolution. Now there's an important term here. So evolution is the idea that species or populations can change over time. Because often people have an incorrect idea that an individual organism can evolve over time. Like those fish in the aquarium back there. Yeah. Can that large fish evolve to have another fin on the top of it? That individual can?
No. I don't know.
How many people say no? Everyone else says yes? So you that said no are correct. That fish has certain genes, DNA it was born with, that give it those characteristics. And those aren't going to change. It's born that way, that's the way it's going to live its entire life. Those fish in that aquarium, those individuals cannot evolve over time. Just like we can't evolve over time. Okay? I can't develop some new trait in my lifetime. Okay? I'm born with a certain genes and traits and characteristics, and I'll have those my entire life. So individuals cannot evolve. They cannot adapt to new conditions. Okay? A population or a group of organisms, however, can change over a long period of time. A species can change. Okay? And that's a difference that we'll talk about. So, one of the ways we can help start understanding evolution is to think about this concept we call artificial selection. Artificial selection is similar to evolution, but it's not nature choosing which organisms can survive and which don't. It's humans doing it. So artificial selection is when humans sort of guide this change in species over time. For example, one of the most common examples that we can use to understand is dogs. dogs as a species have not been around forever. They're relatively recent. Where did domestic dogs evolve from? Luke? Wolves. They're descended from wolves. And it was actually not nature that changed a group of wolves into dogs. It was humans. And it's through this process of artificial selection. So in, hundreds of thousands of years ago, in human settlements, when wolves would come around, generally that wasn't a good thing. People did not want wolves around. But if some of these wolves happen to be not very aggressive, a little bit tamer, because there's some natural variation, well, maybe humans did want them around. Maybe they kept away other animals. Maybe they ate scraps of food and cleaned up after people. And so maybe humans allowed some of those wolves to stay around. And maybe they actually fed them. But what would humans do with aggressive, dangerous wolves? Would they allow them to stay around? No. They likely would kill them or not allow them to have food around the camp. And so those wolves that they allowed to stay, the tamer of the wolves, when they reproduce, what are their wolf pups going to be like?
They're going to be tamer.
Probably also have a similar sort of temperament. What if they have that litter of pups and some of those are aggressive? What are humans going to do? Get rid of them and allow only the ones that are sort of tamer to be allowed. And if you repeat that process hundreds of times, eventually you end up with a species that's quite different from the original wolf population. And those might have been the first dogs. And if you continue those steps, what if you take the very smallest of those dogs and allow them to breed together hundreds of times? What do you think you end up with? Small dogs. What if you take the dogs that are the very best swimmers and breed them together? You get dogs that are good swimming dogs. And so humans actually, by choosing which of these animals could reproduce, actually guided the species to change in certain ways. All of our modern dog breeds come from these original gray wolves. Okay? But it's humans have decided. Humans continue to do that. Humans decide they want a little tiny toy poodles. They take the tiniest little poodles, allow them to breed together, repeat that generation after generation, you have tiny little dogs. Okay? And so we've also done it with agricultural crops especially. So humans intervening in reproduction can help certain traits come about. The things we eat today, corn or potatoes or tomatoes, wheat, those all came from wild plants sometime in the distant past. But again, humans decided which to breed together and eventually formed what we have as modern fruits and vegetables and crops and domestic animals. Here are some pictures that are kind of interesting. This is what the ancestor of our corn that we use today, like corn on the cob, originally looked like before humans started artificially selecting for larger ears and more bigger kernels, sweeter corn. This is what watermelon probably originally looked like. Obviously much different than it is today, but when humans chose which seeds to plant, of the larger of the fruits or the sweetest, then they guided that over time. They do.
There's this one commercial that's going out for about like 2 or 3 months now, and it talks about how every dog has is that like there's a wolf in every dog.
Yeah, and that's kind of true, right? Because all dogs evolved from one what we call common ancestor, which were gray wolves a long time ago. So modern crops, dogs, cows, pigs, chickens, they all had ancestors that were wild ancestors, but through this artificial selection, humans sort of turned them into something more useful to us. Natural selection, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, is sort of the same thing, but it's not humans deciding which ones live and die and which ones can breed. It's nature determining which survive and which don't. Okay? Some examples of artificial selection, selecting for, cats that are hairless. These are all the different breeds and how they evolved and where they evolved from. Got ancestral corn, which eventually was bred into modern corn. But this leads us to this question, because how do we know species change over time? How do we know species have evolved? Well, there's some really good pieces of evidence that scientists use to help them understand this. One of the most important are fossils. You know what a fossil is? What is a fossil? Brandon?
After a very long period of time, a former living organism goes into an object that's being below ground.
Yeah, it's when the remains or the traces of an organism from the distant past get permanently sort of solidified in rock. And then we can find those fossils sometimes. Here's an insect preserved in amber. Anyone been to the American Museum of Natural History in New York? Okay. They have huge displays of fossils of dinosaurs and other animals that were found in the ground. And so we know by looking at these fossils and studying them what things may have looked like in the distant past. What organisms were alive, which organisms were not alive at that point. And fossils form in sedimentary rock. Where do you find the oldest fossils? David? Yeah, these layers are put down one on top of the other. The farthest one down is the one that is the oldest. So we can also tell by looking at which layers these fossils are in when these organisms were alive. Okay? So fossils provide us for good evidence. We have fossils of horses that were once the size of small little dogs, and they had like 4 toes. We also have fossils a little bit later, which show them larger in size, and then they only had 3 toes. And we can see these fossils showing us the transition from these ancient little dog-sized horses to what we have today, modern horses. We can also see how organisms have structures in common. For example, this shows the bones of 4 animals, a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. Now, do those things, if you were just to look at them outwardly, seem very similar? Probably not. Bat flies through the air. Okay? A whale swims in the ocean. Cats and the human, they seem quite different. But when we actually look in the limbs of those organisms, we see the bones are actually very similar. Like we have an upper arm bone, a humerus. Okay? It's also found in a cat. The same bone, it's smaller, but it's still there, a single bone in the whale, and also in the bat. In our forearm, we have 2 bones, the ulna and the radius. Okay? Again, they're present in the cat. They're also here in the whale and the bat as well. Hello? Okay. Also, if we look in the wrist bones, they're there in all these species. The fingers, even though a whale flipper seems like it's solid, it's like the fin of a fish, it's actually not. It has long finger bones inside of it. And the wing of a bat has those same sort of finger bones. So why would they all be so similar? They look very different. Why do they have similar bone structure? Jordan?
Because they're all from the same human.
Not quite, but you're really close. Because they all evolved from what we call a common ancestor. At some point in the past, there was an ancestor that evolved into all of these different species. And we can see, because they have those similar bone structures, that helps us to understand that. Same thing happens in plants. Eva, you need to go to the counseling office, okay? See you later. Have a good day. Bye.